Welcome, everyone, to the Penny Stamps Distinguished Speaker Series. Today, we present Partner Emeritus and Executive Design Director of the global design company IDEO, Jane Fulton Surrey. Yeah. And welcome to, I see we have a heavy design-laden audience. I was excited to see some of you designers out there. Thank you for coming. I want to thank our partners for their support of today's program: Detroit Creative Corridor Center, stewards of the UNESCO City of Design designation, and AIGA Detroit, and Michigan Radio 91.7 FM. I don't know how many of you caught the New York Times Magazine this week, but I thought it was apropos to our design focus today. Pictured on the cover of the magazine is a square bicycle tire. And this was referencing the article in the magazine, Makeover Mania, the 21st Century Craze for Redesigning Everything. So if you didn't catch it, it's a good read, actually. Jane read it. As you walked through the lobby today, you probably noticed we had the Stamp School International Fair with faculty talking to students about study abroad opportunities. The Stamp School is deeply committed to internationalization. That's a word. It is the only school or college at U of M that requires all of its students to have a significant international experience, and today we're celebrating this commitment. Since 2013 and the inception of the international requirement for graduation, the school has supported 423 students abroad, many of whom studied through programs led by our very own dedicated faculty. And today marks the kickoff for courses for the 2017 abroad opportunities in China, India, Japan, and France, led by Robert Adams, Lou Marinero, Melanie Manos, and David Turnley. And STAMP's Director of International Study Programs, Sandy Wiley, who's with us today, asked me to remind all of you students to use mCompass to find further information about your study abroad courses. And students, I just want to point out, I hope that you will find our speaker today an inspiration on the internationalization front, as she has referred to herself as a global nomad, engaging with leaders and teams in IDEO's California, Massachusetts, London, and Tokyo studios. Next week, we will be on hiatus for the Thanksgiving break, and I wish all of you a wonderful time with family and friends, and may all of us find nourishment. We will have a regular Q&A today, so please do join us in the screening room if you want to meet Jane after the talk here. Go out the doors to the left and down the corridor, and you'll find there's the screening room, another theater in the theater there. So we will be there directly after the talk here on stage. And now for a proper introduction of our guest today, please welcome Professor and Industrial Designer Bruce Tharp.
Hello. 23 years ago, when I was an industrial design graduate student, I was struggling, already educated as a mechanical engineer, to have a grasp on how things work technically. I was drawn back to school in hopes of better understand why things worked experientially, emotionally, even spiritually, and by whom. And sadly, I began to realize the field of design did not yet widely have these wide tools to get at these more human questions. It was bad enough that I didn't get support from faculty and the design community, but I was actually dissuaded, warned about how knowledge of the user was actually an impediment to creativity. Information was the enemy of inspiration. Somehow I stumbled upon anthropology as a possible discipline that would allow me to both ask and answer questions about the social, cultural, and human stuff that surrounded all this physical stuff. But was it possible to connect anthropology and design? The answer to this now seemingly obvious question came from a few faint voices at the time, and notably from women, like Lucy Suchman at Xerox PARC, independent consultant Susan Squires, Liz Sanders at the design consultancy Fitch, and Jane Fulton Surrey at IDEO. We've come a long way, baby. Design research, design ethnography, and design anthropology are now part of the everyday routine. Information is no longer the enemy of inspiration, but its ally. So tonight we're fortunate to have with us a human-centered research pioneer, Jane Fulton Surrey. For nearly 30 years, and since its inception, she's worked for the world's best-known and most influential global design consultancy, IDEO. The industries and types of projects that she's worked on are as broad as you can imagine. Think products, environments, services, systems, and strategies. With a background in psychology and architecture, she's championed a user-centered approach and developed many of the empathic tools and prototyping techniques that designers take for granted today. She's co-authored the iconic IDEO method cards used for design research and ideation, the inspirational book Thoughtless Acts on everyday people's agency in hacking their surrounds, and most recently, the Little Book of Design Research Ethics that promotes the core values of respect, honesty, and responsibility. She's taught at the California College of the Arts, Stanford, Berkeley, as well as other schools internationally. Formerly the co-lead of IDEO's consumer experience practice, she's now partner emeritus and their executive design director. Throughout her esteemed and visionary career, she's redefined research as an activity to inspire empathy and spark imagination, and is still focused today on developing new ways of tackling the world's contemporary challenges. So let's give a warm, human-centered welcome to Jane Fulton Surrey.
Thank you. Wow, well, that was nice, and what a thrill to be here. So, yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about what brought me here, and the big thing really is, well, it's in the title, is through my career, I've realized that life itself is a source of tremendous inspiration and information to help us who are interested in making positive change in the world. And when I say life, I mean everyday life, I mean your life, my life, the life of people that we're designing for, the people in the future whose lives we're intending to impact. But also, I'm meaning by life that force that underlies the nature of all animate things, all living things. So that big idea of life, of which, of course, we are an integral part. But I'd like to tell you a little bit of a story about how that all came to be by talking a little about my life. I hope you will indulge me. It's history. So I was born in the 50s in the north of England to parents who were a little unconventional at the time for the north of England, artists and art educators. There's my mum, me, my two brothers, and my dad. This was the sitting room, which is the special room for guests. My dad painted this enormous horse on the wall. You can see paintbrushes in the background there. You can see the mane of the horse. Maybe, unfortunately, we don't have a great picture of it, but this was the backdrop of our best room, this mural. And live candles on the tree, so really living on the edge we were. My two brothers and my sister and myself, this is a sort of typical what we'd do for vacation. Everything got piled into the Morris Traveller with all the camping gear on top. And we'd set off. We slept in the back of the car on the journey, and we'd just drive and drive until we could see the sea. And we'd find some spot where we could see the sea, a field, and make a camp. And we'd be there pretty much for the entire summer. We'd be up with the sun and down to the beach as soon as we'd had our cornflakes. And one day, I would have been about 9, we had breakfast, set off down the path, down to the beach, with our little boogie board and buckets and spades and towels and the whole thing. And when we got to the beach, just as the path came onto the beach, I just stopped and noticed, really, really upset, because the beach was covered in wrappers of like ice cream and picnic waste and just papers and stuff scattered all over. And we had been taught as children, you don't litter. I mean, we were used to beauty in the landscape, and you don't litter. You put your litter in the bin. So I looked around, hey, there's no bin. So, well, I can make one. And I ran off back to the camp and found a big cardboard box that had food supplies in it, brought it down, put it on the corner by just where I'd spotted the litter. And then I thought, better put some litter in it, because otherwise it'll look like litter, right? So I did, and then forgot about it and went on and clambered on the rocks with other families and friends and had picnics and played in the water. The sun goes down, we pack up our stuff, all wet and sandy, you know how it is, and set off back to the camp. And we went past my box, and I looked at my box, and it's full. It was full of litter. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing. And that story, I had completely forgotten this until a colleague very recently said to me, was there anything in your childhood that ever sort of set you on a path, you think? And this must have been there because I remembered. And I think, reflecting, that was a moment of a sense of, well, certainly a rewarding sense of agency for me about being able to make a difference to something that mattered to me in the world, and a sort of insight into something about what people find intuitive. Because as I reflect about what's been going on, I think that's been a passion for me, has been wanting to understand what people find intuitive and somehow working with it. So very much working with life. Anyway, so hold that. I grew up in the countryside, in a small town, and then, school, and it's time to go to university, and what to do. And, adolescence is a time when you start to ask a lot of questions and look. I was really looking beyond the horizon. I know there's other stuff. I know there's London, for example. I didn't go to London, but I know there's London, and there's stuff out there over the horizon and things I need to learn about. And I don't want to do the art thing because my parents have done that. So I think I'm really interested in people. Well, actually, I think I was really interested in myself, actually, if I'm honest. But I wanted to know what was going on, and could I learn anything useful that would be help me through life. So I went off, traded that for a very gritty northern city of Manchester, and I elected to study psychology. That picture is actually from back then, which must have been in the mid-60s, I think. So you can see some high-rises going up, but very much an old brick kind of university place. That was the psychology department. And that's a whole department, like all the faculty, all the students, grad students, everything. And it was, it wasn't super diverse, but it was diverse for the north of England at that time. And the curriculum was very, very broad, from clinical psychology that covered things like aversion therapy and electric shocks for undesirable behavior, which I found really appalling. Like, we shouldn't be using psychology for this kind of behavior change. But many other things, experimental psychology and child development psychology and social psychology, really interested me, intrigued me. In particular, two people. One was Edward Hall, who is an anthropologist, was an anthropologist actually, and he wrote a book called The Silent Language, which was all about the way that we use space in our relationships and other things, but communicate non-verbally, so our posture and the way we use space. So the fact that there was some sort of rhyme and reason and some regularity in what otherwise I think I'd always assumed was fairly random behavior, I found that really quite inspiring. And then a psychologist whose name is Robert Sommer, who worked in Davis at the time, American, had done some really interesting studies about people's space and found, again, regularities in what might appear to be random. And he found that he could ask people to sit in these different sitting relationships and discovered that there was some predictability about the kind of conversation that they would end up having, that if they sat opposite, they would tend to be more competitive in the way they spoke and so on. So I've always tried to sit like this myself, given a chance. It's useful information. It works because not only does it end up kind of encouraging people to behave in a particular way, it is also something that people choose by instinct, pretty much, if they're in that kind of relationship. And there's all sorts of reasons, like eye contact, and you might need to share something. But I found this all really fascinating and got very excited about. If we could understand more about this and how space was important, maybe we could design better spaces. So I got so excited that I thought I'd like to do a study, because one of the things, well, I had to do a final year project. You know, you have to do those. And I had been enjoying the social cohesion, the sense of community in my psychology department. That group of people I just showed you seemed really friendly and knew one another well, and it was good. And I thought, I wonder if the old ramshackle building, this was the psychology building, because it's been adapted and it's all ad hoc, there's all these partition walls and little funny little corridors and little spaces where people put chairs, and notice boards are all it was all very higgledy-piggledy and ramshackle inside. And I thought, I bet that's helping us all get to know one another, because there's all these places you bump into people around the corner and almost literally bump into them, and then places that you hang out and talk. And I thought, I'm going to compare this with the English department, where I was also doing classes, that was just one long corridor with doors that were shut, because everybody just went to see their tutor and sat in there. And I thought, I wonder if they're not quite as friendly with one another and they don't know one another, maybe. So I did a crazy study of very low tech on the quarter hour, rushing around with a clipboard, marking down where everybody was in the English department in the public spaces and where everybody is in the psychology department in the public spaces, and whether they're with other people talking or they're just standing, and analysed that and did a funny sort of questionnaire that was basically a sort of network analysis. And I found, yes, actually, it's all happening. Certainly, there were more people in the psychology department who were meeting each other. I think there were lots of reasons why they were more social, and I think some of those were things like just they'd self-selected, and you can imagine by the subject matter, and also we had better parties in psychology, and we had better drugs in psychology, so there were all sorts of really good reasons. But it doesn't matter, you know, all this, it's all experimental and variables, and you always acknowledge all the other variables, so that was fine. But it was enough to affirm this idea that space matters and it affects people, and I want to study it. And where do you study space, and who makes all the design decisions about space? Well, it's architects, isn't it? So I wheedled my way into an architecture department in another gritty city in Scotland. This was Strathclyde University, full of architects. And this building was, it's funny because I worked in that building. I worked in one of those rooms down there, and it was kind of famous for this post-war brutalism in Scotland, and because it was one of the very few at that time purpose-built architecture departments. But it was kind of sad because it wasn't purpose-built for me. It didn't work really very well for me. It was so hard because I was a psychology graduate and a not very confident one either, except that I had this idea that I ought to be working with these people. But they were dedicated to their drawing boards, and they only wanted really, really quick rules of thumb from psychology. They didn't have time to explore about people. And I was all about exploring, and I wanted to work with them. And there was no there was no sense of interdisciplinary. I had a tutor in the psychology department to look after me and a tutor in the architecture department, but they never talked to one another, and the students didn't talk to one another, and there was no real interest. So that was a bit tough. I wasn't very happy, really, but I really enjoyed Glasgow, and one of the things that fascinated me was what was happening there in the city from a housing point of view. So at that time, which now is early 70s, there was a huge urban renewal going on, particularly in housing. Glasgow was a shipbuilding city, and shipbuilding had declined, and there was a lot of unemployment and a lot of poverty, and buildings that were, I don't know when they were built, but tenements that were pretty much slums, and people sharing toilets, and family living in some of the areas was just very, very desperate. And of course, then, the way to do that was to knock them all down, sort of disseminate the community who had been established over decades, and put up amazing modern buildings and house them here. So this was the Red Road Flats, which is a very, very famous building experiment which utterly failed. It was pretty new when I was there, and I looked at it and thought, I'd love to know what it's like to bring up a family and be a child and grow up in that situation. So I set off on my little Honda 50 to go and investigate, and it was quite famous, and they were proud to be living there, so people were quite happy when some stranger knocked on the door and asked if they could talk. It was quite odd, but they let me in, and I'd sit and have a cup of tea and talk with them, and the views were amazing from way up there, 33 stories, but the living was really dreadful. There were common landings that were just rough and scruffy and already getting vandalized, and nobody cared. The houses were quite nice, but there was nothing to do. They were just living boxes. So I was quite upset by this, but I wanted to understand more about the families, so I kept going back over a period of time. And there was one day, I used to look down from up there and look at my little Honda down there in the car park all by itself, because nobody had cars or anything. And I used to wonder if it would still be there, but it was always there. But anyway, one time I came down in the elevator, which itself was really depressing, and I'm really depressed because I think this is no way to live. And I walked out into this landscape, which is also fairly depressing. It's very just concrete. And I was making my way back to the bike, and suddenly I heard the sound of children laughing, and well, where's that coming from? There is nowhere for children to laugh. But I went around the corner of a building and saw that there were 5 boys who were playing on a door to the boiler room at the base of this block. They'd sort of broken in and were bashing it backwards and forwards and swinging on it. And I took this picture of one of those boys, and they really were having fun, you know. They were about 10 years old. It was the only thing in that environment that moved, basically, and they were playing as kids do. And it's funny because I've kept that picture. It's also in Thoughtless Acts, the book, because it really spoke to me about something that was not quite fitting, about if only people could see the way that children really are, they wouldn't make a place for them to live that looked like this, would they? And maybe I should be collecting lots and lots of pictures like this that would help designers and architects maybe design better things. And I thought, perhaps I should have an exhibition in that brutalist building that would show some of these scenes. But I had no confidence, and I didn't do it. And as you'll hear, it took a long time for this to go anywhere, but that struck and stuck. And then it was getting about time to get a proper job. And I really wanted to work with architecture, architects, despite the fact that I hadn't, because I really wanted to influence space. But it was a bad time in architecture from a financial point of view, and I didn't have it in me. I didn't know. I wouldn't have known what to do. So anyway, instead, though, I did get a job, and I worked in ergonomics. Human factors, I think, here, but mostly not just physical. This is just an example, but really about how we make things that fit people physically or cognitively, perceptually, emotionally. Less about emotion, actually, more just functional fit. And I thought, well, people are paying for this, and I don't know anything about it, so I should probably go and learn a bit about that, and I can get paid and learn at the same time. So that's what I did. And at that time, I'd upgraded the Honda 50. This was my 404 Sport, 4-into-1. It's a very good bike. However, anyway, my first project in this job happened to be about motorcycles, so I was super excited to do that. And this is my data all taken from investigating how might drivers be helped to see motorcyclists more easily, because there were so many accidents where drivers just said, didn't see him, mate, sorry, didn't see him. So we looked at lighting and clothing, but lighting, and the government funded this work. And then there was legislation about lighting, daytime lighting for bikes, which I had something to do with. So that was a good moment to influence something. And my next job, the data was drawn from home accidents, and this was just a starting point, of course, for a project. But my project then, because of the way this database was managed and set up, we could go back to people who had had incidents of injury with tools and find out what they had been doing. And in many cases, I was able to ask them to show me what you were doing, and let's go to the shed and get this thing out, and then we can see exactly what were you doing. So I was then able to make meaning and understand the people who you see in this database of having done apparently something really stupid with a tool. Actually, it wasn't really stupid. It was pretty predictable that it would happen when you looked at the situation and you looked at the design. So the blade gets stuck, and here you are trying to free it, and you're holding the handle, but there's the switch right there. And so you could imagine, just a moment, and then your fingers are damaged forever. So these stories and pictures became pretty powerful. This one was amazing. This guy is actually holding the guard of this chainsaw, which is meant to protect you from the blade if you get any kickback. The handle is behind it, but they don't look different. In addition, the balance of the tool made you want to hold the front because that's where the mass was best balanced. So that enabled me to then have conversations with Black & Decker, bless them, about let's rethink how you're doing the guard, and let's not make another one like this. And of course, that sets up a dynamic that I didn't like very much, which was I'm having to tell you stuff, like you've been wrong, and I'm policing you now, I'm feeling like design police, and I felt I don't want this. I want to be working with people who are making these decisions, because doing this in this way, it's too late, but it's also not a good social or creative relationship. I'm not enjoying it. I really, really want to collaborate. So that set me off on a mission to find a way to get engaged, and that was pretty hard and took quite a long time, but I really, really had an amazing lucky break. I was in California. I'd taken a break from my job, and a friend who was a client of this man, this is Bill Moggridge, said to me, you really need to go and meet this guy, because I think he's thinking what you're thinking, but he doesn't know. you, so you should go meet him. So I went to meet him. And it's funny because I couldn't Google him then. I'd not heard of him, but I went through design magazines and I realized that every issue of ID magazine had either an article about him or one of his people or some of his products. And he was pretty famous, really famous guy. This is amazing. He had designed this in 1974, just beautiful space heater. And I've always really loved this, but in his philosophy of design was always, it's for people, and I want to make them happy, and I want to make them feel good about everything that they use and that they have in their life, and I want them to be able to understand how it works, and it's for people. I'm designing for people. That's the main idea. And he was studying ergonomics. He had things like that tool I showed you, of the ergonomics tool. But he was also, at that time, designing the firsts of things. This was the first laptop. And there were no ergonomics standards about how to design the first laptop because it was a first, it was the new one. And he wanted to develop some different ways to help inform and inspire that process. So we were kind of meeting across this gulf. And he showed me this picture, which was an image he had created for Xerox at that time, thinking about what might screens. I mean, we've only just got laptops. We didn't have graphical user interfaces, and we just had a mouse, but he's now designing a pen input, and he's thinking about flat screens. He's thinking about multicolor displays, and he's projecting a future and showing how this person might use it. And he's a tremendous storyteller, and he invented these people and these situations. They were coming out of his head. That's what designers do. But he said to me, "Do you think you might do something like this?" And I said, I remember I said this because I thought, I hope this isn't going to be a bad thing, because I really wanted a job. And I said, I think I might, but I think I'd go and meet some real people too. And that was like our mirror image, I think, in a way. He liked that idea, so that's what happened. And I found myself in his studio. I had to pinch myself. This is in North Beach in California. Remember, I'm from the north of England. And here I am in this amazing space, drawing boards, no computers. Actually, no people, you see. But the people are on the roof. And so this was the gang. You see Bill and me. And actually, if anybody knows him, because he has spoken here, this is Tim Brown. But we had this incredible view of Telegraph Hill and Coit Tower, and I couldn't believe it. These people were wonderful designers and engineers. And I was really happy, except that I kept thinking, I'm supposed to know something now. This man's paying me. I'm a psychologist, and I'm supposed to know stuff. And I knew some things. Designers would ask me questions like, do you think people will understand how to use this, or how big should this be? And I maybe could answer some of those questions. But then there'd be questions like, how are people going to use the kitchen of the future? What's going to happen? What are people going to do? You know about people, you're supposed to know this stuff. They didn't say you're supposed to know this stuff. I thought I'm supposed to know this stuff. And then I realized, no, I don't have to. I don't have to be an expert. I need to explore, and I need to explore with them. We need to do this together. So then we can go out into the world. I know how to do that, look at everyday life. I can take pictures. I can take designers with me, and they can do what they know how to do best, which is to imagine from what they're seeing, all the inputs that they have. So together, empathizing and imagining and looking at real life, we came to different conclusions, like, well, maybe the kitchen of the future is about a sort of living activity lab for families. I mean, it's an activity exploration space. Or maybe it's more like, for a hobbyist chef, it's more like a sort of control center, and it's a workshop, that sort of feeling. So that would inform and inspire very different kinds of scenarios for future ideas and then products and so on. And that really began to work, and we developed something then of a method, which was whatever we were given. This was working on a computer strategy for NEC, actually in Japan. And we would take our clients to go visit people and just explore what's happening now, but not get bogged down with trying to just fix things, but be thinking expansively when we saw. So it was typical that we would have imagery, and I remember this in particular, this story about a salesman that we went to visit, and he was showing us how he wanted to show his potential purchaser things on the screen, but he couldn't hold it properly and press the buttons. And we didn't do the design of this, but our client then was very inspired by that and came up with this, which is very prescient, really, because it was called the NEC Versa, and meaning versatile, and you could take the screen off and you could just use the screen as a slate screen, like the Surface now that Microsoft's just released, and all sorts of different peripherals that you could attach. But it was way ahead of its time, but established NEC very strongly in that market. And I'm not saying it's all because of that image, but it was that sort of process that informed and inspired the design. And it would sort of work like this, like we'd have a collection of evidence from the world. This project, this is a bit meta, because this was a project about digital imagery before digital cameras were around. This was work for Kodak. And so we wanted to look at what's the behavior now relative to imagery, not just cameras and taking photographs, but how's imagery playing into people's lives? And then looking at what matters to people, lots of things that matter, and pulling out important themes, and then coming up with ideas. That was kind of the plan. And so just on that topic, because it did go somewhere, it's really interesting to me looking back. This is literally 20 years ago that this was done. The idea of images as fluid as words, in contrast to what was the paradigm then, which was, no, it has to be a glossy image of really, really high quality because you're going to keep it forever. And now we use imagery and we throw it away and it goes off into the stream somewhere. And we make changes while we're capturing now. I don't even know what it's called, but when you can put you put a cat's nose on and whiskers and things when you're taking the picture, don't even know what it's called. Geotagging pictures and just making notes, How many times have you done this? Just grabbed information from some printed thing because you want to refer to it later, or merging video and stills. And I think this is funny because this idea has been and gone, the one of the frame with the pictures in somewhere else. In 20 years, that's been and gone, virtually. Anyway, what we didn't get, I'm ashamed to say, is we didn't predict selfies, which is actually a really big deal that we didn't. But anyway, so this was all beginning to work. This idea of going and looking and the evidence and pictures, and this idea of pictures in particular, this was the moment when I remembered the kid on the door and the idea that capturing these pictures was now actually influencing how designers were thinking. And so we made a book which was called Thoughtless Acts, and called Thoughtless Acts only because, not because they're thoughtless, but because they're not super conscious, they're intuitive. And remembering back to my story before, that intuitive aspect is a part of what seems, for me, really important. Learning what are the things that people just do, sometimes thoughtless, maybe sometimes less. You don't know what was in somebody's mind when they matched those shapes, or even looking in the wallet. maybe more intentional or more aware anyway. He's created an acoustic chamber here, and he's got his fine place for please donate signal, which everybody understands. Who's done this with a tea bag? I think there's a whole book about ways of coping with tea bags, actually. But really nice. And on the tea theme, just the way that objects mediate social relationships. I just love the way you can almost feel the collusion and the closeness between those folks. This needs a bit of background. In the London Underground, they took litter bins away. This is another litter bin story, very funny, because of bombs. And so no litter bins, but people want to behave in an orderly way, and they can't take their drinks down into the tube, in the London Tube. So this was happening. And how the same object means really different things in a different context. As in the Japanese park, please put your litter here. And this is Berkeley, California, with it meaning, I guess it means park here because it's free, but these aren't working. So there. And the book, of course, was really just a tool to provoke people to see. You might notice it didn't have any captions, which we had to argue about that, but because books with pictures should have captions. But my point about it was, no, I want people to look and decide what does it. They're just everyday life. It's around us all the time, and life does not have captions. So make your own. And so this approach now, I think, it's whether we're designing something relatively simple like a new chair for schools that supports students in new ways of, new styles of sort of mobile classroom and group activity, or if we're designing a new whole curriculum and education system in Peru for kids who've never had this opportunity before, it is not surprising to go back to the source, to go back to everyday life now, not to copy, but to look for inspirations about what's going on. And that's become core to this idea of human-centered design, design thinking, which is now, there's courses online about it, people are learning about it in business schools, we're learning about it through projects with government, we've been working in healthcare, and I mean, many of you have adopted this approach, and it's pretty exciting to find that kind of human centeredness brought into design just now as a really normal thing. It's hard to imagine that 30 years ago, or 23 years ago, as Bruce was saying, that wasn't really commonplace at all. And now it just seems so obvious and so natural. So that's a really good thing, isn't it? So we'll take a big, deep breath now. I said in the beginning that when I was talking about life, I mean everyday life, but also I've been inspired by this comment about human life and its limitation, because we're the ones who are thinking about it. We are really part of life in a bigger sense, and I've been quite interested in how design challenges now, which seem to be more systemic, more actually forcing us to face our relationship with nature in a different way. We're realizing that we want to be able to feed people, for people to have clean, fresh water and fresh air, and we are also learning about our own microbiome, which is our own ecosystem all over our skin, our gut. We're discovering how critical that is to our own health and well-being. We're also beginning to design with life. We're getting down to the building blocks of life, to DNA, and understanding new ways to configure life. Perhaps we should know some more. And so I started wanting to work with biologists as a way of expanding from human to a broader idea of ourselves. I was reading, I've just started reading The Botany of Desire by Michael Pollan, and he said something which I thought was very interesting, that humans are the only species who talk about or think about themselves as having a relationship with nature. No other species has a relationship with nature. They just are. Anyway, my first opportunity to work with a biologist was on an organizational design problem, and systemic design problems, I think, are really interesting from this perspective. This was a piece of work for the US Green Building Council, who are the people who run the LEED program and award buildings certification for good practices, good environmental practices. And they had got themselves into what they regarded as a bit of a pickle with their chapter organizations. So they have chapters all over the US. They're centralized in Washington, but they have chapters where really all the work goes on. And more than that, the volunteer work that gets done by architects or just people to further this idea of green building, they depend on that hugely for the success. But the volunteers were getting a little bit disgruntled because they kept getting kind of mandates and issues from Washington to say, this year we're going to focus on solar. And they had a really nice project going on with sort of gardening and different materials, or they're working in edible schoolyard, or something that's to do with building, but it's local. It's good for them locally, but the national agenda didn't quite work. And so they, being ecological, thought that maybe a biological approach might be interesting, so they sponsored this experiment. And we mashed together a sort of human-centered, we thought about all sorts of organizations that have better structures and where volunteers are very happy to work, like maybe in religions, for example, a human example. But we also thought about examples from nature, and we all brought examples of things we thought might be relevant to that challenge. And the biologist was Tim McGee, and he showed this diagram, which was a really big opener, aha moment for me. He talked about this fungal mat, the fungal mat being a fungus growing, and they're the biggest structures in the world, on the earth. They're connected for miles and miles and miles. And what they're doing is transporting nourishment, water, sugar around, and in doing so, also feeding an ecosystem. So imagine a tree that's in the sunshine and photosynthesizing and creating lots of sugar. That then gets spread into the valleys where there's maybe it's darker and the trees don't have access to the same sort of nourishment. And the tree in the bottom there is in a swampy area, so water can get taken uphill through the fungal mat. And we're like, this is what the national organization should be like, the fungal mat. They should be moving resources around to making them accessible for the chapters, like the chapters might be the leaves on the trees or the fruit from the trees, but through these structures, let's think about it entirely differently. And I smile about this because I don't think every organization would be pleased to hear that they should be a fungus, really. But they were really excited to think about how their structure could reflect more of this idea, and through expertise that they could supply from the national headquarters, help those local projects get access to the information they needed. So that was one. Really, this was a very quick project, but they took this away and have been working on definitely rethinking their structure away from the hierarchy to this more bottom-up way of thinking. And another idea we had for communication was thinking about the simple rules in nature and how nature has organization through each individual, just having a very simple thing to think about, like fly this distance from the bird in front and maintain your distance to this bird at the side, and the whole flock can move in unison and be organized without a top-down rule. Maybe we could create something like the simple rule might be a chapter member has 2 buddies in 2 other chapters, and then you scale that up across the whole nation, and you've got this really resilient, interconnected communication web. And they started to work on that one too. So that was just 2 things that came from working with a biologist that made me very excited about what more knowledge about that kind of life could help us with in design. And I'm just going to mention 2 things about why I think that's important for design. And one is allowing for outcomes to emerge rather than, I think, what I learned in design is our job is to design the stuff and the thing and determine what it is. But as we move into these broader challenges that are more systemic, we need to be thinking more about how are we going to create conditions for things to emerge. And so like the organization of a flock of birds, how can we come up with the simple rules or come up with a structure that helps? So a simple rule that is a very top-down simple rule is traffic lights. You have to stop or go, and everybody knows, and it works, but it's not very adaptive to local conditions. You've probably all been at traffic lights when there's no other traffic around, and you have to wait until it goes green. Or it's green, but you can't move because the junction's full of people who didn't clear last time. So they're not adaptive to local conditions and actually don't have a very wide area of being efficient. But roundabouts, in contrast, they put all the decision-making back down to each individual driver who has to follow their own rules, which is approach carefully and look one way, and if there's a space, go into it, and if there isn't a space, wait. Very simple, but it's very broadly dispersed intelligence that makes that work, and it's very adaptive to local conditions. It's also, in some circumstances, safer. Not always, but it's got a good record, and I know there aren't very many in the States. There's a lot in the UK, but the roundabout is a sort of swarm intelligence system that I think is a nice example. And I don't know if you know about termite mounds, but I was interested to learn from our biologist that if that termite mound had been built maybe 10 feet to the right or left, it would be a different shape because it's totally locally responsive. They need to get airflow through that structure to keep them all alive, and they have to deal with really huge ranges of temperature difference in Africa. And each little termite, there's no blueprint, each little termite just follows the simple rule. Walk around. If you sense high CO2, pick up a piece of dirt, walk around. When you sense low CO2, stick it down, keep going. And that's what they're doing. And they're changing the structure dynamically over time to cope with the fluctuations in air conditions for themselves. It's amazing, amazing, but super intelligent. And the other idea, which I think is really important and apposite for design, is designing for relationships, designing for mutual benefit in systems. And my experience in design has been quite a lot like a client will come and say, well, we've got to beat the competition on this one, and we're competing for this space on this, and I want my product to be the most important thing in people's desk situation, or it's all very thing-oriented and a competitive mindset. And I think one of the things I'm learning from life is that everything is related, and you could change something and something else changes, and actually the way that life has worked and evolved, there's a huge amount of harmony and mutuality and benefit. So what you're looking at here is a juniper tree with a mistletoe growing in it. And according to Tim, my biologist friend, the mistletoe has always been considered to be a parasite because it goes and sticks itself to the tree and digs its veins into, pulls out all the nourishment from the tree, and that's what we call a parasite in biology. But people are really questioning this now because what's been discovered is if you stop and look at this over a longer period, you notice that actually the trees with the mistletoe parasite do way better than the ones that don't have it, because birds come because they love the mistletoe better than the juniper, but while they're on the tree with the mistletoe, they take the juniper berries too. Why not? And so that the genes of those trees perpetuate them more successful. And I think that's really interesting. Even in biology, they're still discovering this mutuality that takes place in systems. So really, it's symbiotic. It's not parasitic relationship. And I think, are there systems here? You know, you would think about something. I thought about Amazon, for example, that in many ways was very destructive, has been to, say, small bookshops. Lots of bookshops have gone out of business since the whole Amazon thing took off. But at the same time, Amazon provided a platform that enabled lots of bookshops to have access to a readership and audience that they would never have had, globally, in fact. So if you have rare books, somebody in Australia or Papua New Guinea can find that book in your bookshop, and that was never available. So it sort of depends the frame that you look at, where the benefits are, but I thought that's kind of an example of reciprocal. And then he told me also a story about trees. And I mean, trees are amazing in general because they provide so much habitat for everything else. But when trees die, the last phase of their life, which might be as long as 100 years for an old tree, they are actually at their most generous and most generative. They're giving away molecular structures which are useful for other forms of life in the forest. I thought that they just all kind of crumbled and went into compost and went back to basic molecules, but they're actually giving away more useful assets than that, and made me think about everything having a natural flow, and maybe businesses that are coming to the end of something, how could they be more generous with their assets that would enable us to make progress and build forward. And I think, you know, the open source system is a bit more like that, more generous, and I was very intrigued to hear that last year Tesla, the automotive company, gave away or opened up something like 280 patents that they had on the electrical circuits and battery systems that they've been using in electric vehicles. Because, of course, by giving it away, they grow the pie, as it were. It's reciprocally beneficial because the more that they can move electric vehicle development forward, the more that they will benefit too. So I'm really enjoying this idea of the generosity which is reciprocal. So these ideas, I've just really shared those two, the idea of mutual benefits and the idea of designing for things to emerge, creating conditions for things to emerge. But I've been in Japan for the last 7 months. This is Japan. And I found that Shintoism and Buddhism, for example, don't make a distinction between human and nature. They have a very strong feeling of the connection in that culture. So I've found a lot more resonance there, which has just been interesting and affirming. This is the same tree over the period that I was there. Just people enjoy being, we all enjoy being in nature. I don't think it's a new thing, but I think the feeling there is different. And I want to share a sort of final story. While I'm there, I'm always taking pictures of what continue to be called thoughtless acts. And I like this one. This is a sort of drainer thing machine truck. And I really like how it's all handy and footy. I said it's footy too. Everything's just a hand. But one day, so I'm collecting these images all the time. One day I came on this, and I was with a Japanese colleague, and this is in a railway station where he lives in Kamakura. And I looked up and I'm seeing this, and I said to Gen, my friend, do you think that's because they don't want the bird poop to land on the people in the railway station? Or do you think it's in case maybe the fledglings fall out of the nest? And he said, I don't know, I'll go and ask. And Gen went off to the station office and asked, who had put that structure and why. And he came back and he goes, it's both. And I thought, yeah, that was kind of a giveaway. My question was a giveaway, wasn't it? I have to have it's for people or it's for nature, but it was for both. So then I started thinking, let's go from thoughtless acts to thoughtful acts of mutualism. And that's what I'm really looking out for now, because I think we all have it. We all know deep down that we're all connected to each other and that we're all connected to all the other things in this wonderful world we live in. And so I'm looking for and have found some other examples. I'll just show you. So this thing about birds in Japan is a big deal. This was another setup that I found. And you see the nest and the baby birds? And there's parcel tape all around that nest to help. I have a horrible feeling that somebody started closing that awning and maybe crushed it a bit or something. But anyway, look at the engineering that's gone into this shelf. It's stunning. I mean, it even closes, I think. And then, of course, there's all the signage for people to let them know what's going on. And so I found that one really, really delightful. And even on the building sites, where you have the tarps and everything and all the dust, and the guy, you can hardly see him really, but he's there with a white hat and a blue outfit. He waters the plants every day. They just have this beautiful place. It's beautiful for people, and I expect the plants are quite enjoying it. I'm not sure gardening counts. I think it probably does, but I'm not sure. It's got to be, hasn't it? And then Tim McGee sent me this one of keeping your rats and mice under control in your house. You actually create a house for the owl. I don't know where this is from. I have to find out where he found this. But what a wonderful idea. So, going right back to my very beginning about inspired by life, you see it now, perhaps, this idea about going deep into what's happening in our everyday lives with all its confusion and contradiction and complexity and richness of our own life. But then expanding, not just thinking about ourselves, but we're living in this bigger context of life, and how there are so many opportunities there, I think, to inform and inspire design for the future. So that's really what I wanted to share with you. And I think it's a question of staying curious and keeping our eyes open. So that's, in keeping your eyes open, please, thank you. And then, just quickly, really quickly. So this is an Instagram hashtag. Really quickly, just in case anybody was interested, just today we put on our website a pack of, you don't get a pack of cards because we ran out of packs of cards, but you can download this tool which we designed, which has got some of the stories like the juniper berry thing. If anybody wanted to use this, it's a free resource on ideo.com. Just search under nature cards and it's all yours. Thank you.